Lecture 22, Architecture and Material Arts through the Grand Canyon. We completed the last module talking about history as a social construct, a story that we collaboratively validate and perpetuate that functions as a tool of cultural nationalism. Nations employ history to organize and unite diverse cultural groups and to advance particular ideas about the nation itself. History is inherently political, but it is also shaped by aesthetic philosophies and aesthetically significant cultural products. We discussed how the history of the American West has been significantly influenced by aesthetic products of elite and popular cultures, including George Catlin's ethnographic paintings of Indians, dime novels that concretized the Western literary genre, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and the contemporary film Dances with Wolves. In our final module, we will continue our investigation into the intersection of aesthetic products with history by examining the roles of architecture and material arts in the construction of an imagined past, the Western fantasy at the Grand Canyon. While visual arts like paintings enjoy a de facto classification as art, several other mediums of cultural products have only recently been recognized as having the potential for aesthetic significance. Remember in Module 1 when we identified mediums like photography and film that are now included on the growing list of mediums considered aesthetically valuable? Architecture is now also a medium on that list. Architecture, at its simplest, is the practice of carving out an inner space from an outer space. Architecture is similar to sculpture in that both are actually three-dimensional, as opposed to paintings, which only create the illusion of three-dimensionality. Unlike sculpture, though, we perceive a work of architecture by moving outside of, around, into, and through it. We can examine architectural aesthetics by studying the design and construction of buildings. A work of architecture is constituted by solids, or mass, and voids, or space. Groupings of enclosed spaces or voids are accomplished through the construction of enclosing masses or solids like walls and ceilings. Architecture is like film in that it is a highly complex medium that employs some of the same formal elements as other mediums, but then also includes concerns or considerations that are specific to architecture alone. For instance, safety. Architecture shares with painting the formal elements of line, shape, color, texture, and space. It also shares formal elements with literature and poetry, like rhythm, repetition, metaphor, and symbolism. And it even shares some formal elements with music, like dissonance and harmony. In addition to the aesthetic considerations of these formal elements, architects must also consider technical elements that move the aesthetic design of the structure into a buildable reality. And these technical elements include structural, mechanical, and electrical components. Architectural and structural engineers must take into account the safety, economics, and environmental concerns related to an architectural design. The architect must have the sensibilities of a painter, sculptor, poet, or musician, while also possessing the knowledge and skills of a mathematician and engineer. Architects have the added stress of designing works that are amenable to the public and have a social function. Most buildings, if not privately sponsored, require public funding, And to get that funding, architects must create designs that are aesthetically significant, of course, technically sound, meaning safe, environmentally compatible, and that's talking about the spatial relationship of the building to its surroundings, be it big city or the wilderness. And they must be functional, meaning that they can be used for practical purposes like office buildings, homes, and museums. Architecture is a particularly resilient and lasting medium, able to weather time and change. Because of this, architecture, as scholars David Martin and Lee Jacobus note, is, quote, weighted with the past, end quote. They go on to assert that, quote, not only do the forms of architecture preserve the past more carefully than do most things, for most architects build buildings to last, but these structures also enlighten the past. They interpret the past and they inform about the values of the artist's society. End quote. In this module, we will examine the architectural structures of Mary Jane Elizabeth Coulter. Her works established a new architectural aesthetic in the United States, and they interpret and preserve the imagined past of the American Wild West. Material arts is a far more ambiguous aesthetic category. It is not a medium, per se. It is derived from the more general term material culture, which some of you may have heard of, because it comes from anthropology, and it means any physical, tangible object that has been created or appropriated for use by humans, so an artifact. It is a catch-all category for tangible stuff created and used by people. Like material culture, material arts has also developed as a kind of catch-all aesthetic category for cultural products that have aesthetic significance but are not easily lumped into one of the more standardized categories like painting, literature, dance, or film. Material artworks can include household items like bowls, jars, plates, and baskets, textiles like rugs, blankets, and needlework, clothing, jewelry, religious icons and paraphernalia like rosaries, furniture, tools, weapons, memorial items, and gravestones, as well as advertising publications like pamphlets, brochures, posters, and calendars. Many of these kinds of objects have been relegated by aesthetic philosophers, those guys who theorize what is and is not art, to lesser, quote unquote, lesser categories like folk arts, crafts, kitsch, decorative arts, graphic arts, and popular art. These so-called lesser categories are considered lesser because they are associated with craft or artisanship rather than art or artists, or because they are enabled by the mass production and consumer culture made possible by the Industrial Revolution. And please make sure that you watch art historian and author Dr. Laura Morelli's TED Ed film about the differences between craft and art. Some folks like to refer to this wide-ranging group of aesthetically significant artifacts that I call material arts as visual arts, but I find this term a bit limiting and ocularly biased, meaning visually biased. Many of the works like baskets, rugs, furniture, tools, and religious tchotchkes, while clearly sharing similarities with other visual arts like paintings, they also have tactile, auditory, or olfactory elements. Thus, we will employ the broader phrase material arts. Material arts can be discussed and analyzed using the same vocabulary that we employ to discuss other aesthetically significant cultural products. We can identify the materials, the formal elements, composition, subject matter, and content of these works. The majority of material artworks will exhibit formal elements like line, shape, color, texture, and space, thus their association with the visual arts. But, like architecture, they may also employ formal elements more closely associated with other mediums like sculpture, music, and literature. For instance, a needlepoint wall hanging that tells a story. And like architecture, the work's function, its use value or practical purpose, may be critical to its content, its meaning. Material arts were particularly important to the tourist infrastructure of the Grand Canyon National Park. From the brochures and pamphlets distributed by the Santa Fe Railway to the Indian baskets, rugs, and jewelry sold as souvenirs in Hopi House, to the furniture and textiles that adorned the architectural structures designed by Mary Jane Coulter. Material arts storied the American Southwest as exotic and wild, and they participated in the negotiation of the social issues of gender and class.